I was going to begin my talk with quoting my Cambridge-educated daughter, and I still am, but I just want to say that she worked at G&D's for 4 years, so I know what's in the ice cream that you're going to have later. When I mentioned to my daughter that I was going to speak at an Oxford debate on the motion, "This House believes in God," she said, "What's there to debate? You either do or you don't, and that's an end to it." I don't totally agree with her, but I think she had a point. The question, what is there to debate, is an important one. What exactly do we intend to convey by the statement, "we believe in God"? Both the previous speakers have touched on this issue of definition. What do we mean by believe in? Do we mean that we are inclined to accept the idea that God exists? Or that we approve of the idea of God in the way that one might believe in capitalism? Or that we trust in God to behave in certain ways, as one might believe in Barack Obama as someone to lead the USA and indeed the whole world out of financial crisis? And even more difficult, what do we mean by God? Do we mean an inferred, intentional agent behind the visible universe, something William James describes as primordial, before the foreground of existence, pervading the whole residual cosmos as an everlasting presence? Do we mean the numinous that some claim to have encountered in mystical experiences, what Rudolf Otto calls the holy other? Or are we talking about something more like Paul Tillich's ultimate concern, the one from whom we derive our values, by which we live our lives? Or do we mean the one we serve? Because, as Bob Dylan writes, we all have got to serve somebody. And do we mean somebody or something? Is it a he, a she, an it? And for that matter, why God? Why not gods? But perhaps this kind of argument isn't the sort of enterprise that's like an essay where you start out by setting out definitions of what you're talking about. Perhaps here, the meaning is something that emerges as we go along. Personally, I've never been really sure about God. When I was a small child, I imagined God as a rather stern old man sitting on a cloud. While I was at primary school, the first astronauts were launched into space, and they didn't report seeing God. So I started to wonder if he really was there at all. As I approached secondary school, I'd pretty much decided to jettison the idea of God. It seemed to me an unnecessary hypothesis that might have had a place in a pre-scientific age, but one that we could now well do without. You didn't need God to explain how the world came into being, or how life had begun and species had evolved. You didn't even need God to explain human transcendence, morality, and spirituality. I reckoned that a scientific psychology informed by evolutionary theory was capable of doing that job. I was evidently quite a precocious 11-year-old, though not untypical in my skepticism, because from its earliest days in the 1880s, when Edward Starbuck was researching conversion experiences, the discipline of psychology of religion has recognized the very robust phenomenon of adolescent atheism. And this research indicates that atheism is often a transitory phase for young people, and so it turned out to be for me. My adolescent flirtation with atheism has left me with some sympathy and respect for many who hold that position. But in the end, it was just a flirtation. At the age of 13, I had an experience which challenged me to be more open-minded about God. I didn't abandon my faith in empirical science. nor my scorn for the God of the gaps. But I broadened my horizons, and to paraphrase Shakespeare, I entertained the idea that there are more things in heaven and earth than were dreamt of in my philosophy. Just as the scientist, when faced with data that don't fit her theory, needs to entertain the hypothesis that the world is not as she had thought, I started to wonder if God was not as I had thought. According to the theologian Karl Rahner, opening up to the idea that God is not as I thought is the mark of spiritual growth. In my case, I was driven to wonder if God was at one and the same time more cosmic in scale and more relationally intimate than I had previously imagined. I started to get an inkling that the meaningful question to ask might not be, do I believe in God, but does God believe in me? Nowadays, I describe myself as a follower of Jesus of Nazareth. These words are carefully chosen, for my faith is Christocentric rather than theocentric. I am not a theist who happens, because of my cultural inheritance, to be a Christian. I'm a disciple of Jesus who has found that it is not possible to do Jesus full justice without invoking God talk. I am also highly ambivalent about institutional religion. And here again, I follow Jesus, and indeed St. Paul after him, both of whom were unrelenting in their criticism of the religion of their day. They were arrested, tried, and executed for their pains. The social and psychological sciences also lead us to be cautious about religion. Starting with the work of Gordon Allport after the Second World War, they've convincingly documented the ways in which religions tend to build up a sense of fellowship, well-being and solidarity for their members at the cost of hostility, prejudice, even hatred for those they see as outgroups. This danger is there in all religions, including religious atheism, and, sad for me to say, including institutional Christianity. But it was not always so. According to the Russian Orthodox writer Alexander Schmemann, it was the freedom of the early church from religion in the usual traditional sense of this word that led the pagans into accusing Christians of atheism. Christians had no concern for sacred geography, no temples, no cult. There was no specific religious interest in the places where Jesus had lived. There were no pilgrimages. Schmemann thus reminds us that Christianity has in its origins something in common with atheism, an anti-religious sentiment, something that it loses sight of at its peril. And throughout history, Christians have also been accused of idolatry, the worship of a human being, and the assertion that this human being is divine. It might be said that Christianity is as much a type of humanism as it is a type of theism, and it's certainly how I understand my faith now. Back in the 1960s, as a young person awakening to the sense that God might not be as I had thought, I decided to park the abstract question of God's existence for a while. It didn't seem to have got me very far. Instead, I chose to take a more pragmatic, empirical approach, and as an experiment, after briefly considering Islam, to try in my own way to respond to Jesus' call to follow me. I followed him rather like someone playing grandmother's footsteps, on tiptoe and rather tentatively. I read the New Testament, I pondered on the record of Jesus' life that I found there, I meditated on his wisdom teaching, and I tried to live out his ethics, just as you might with any charismatic thinker. And then I realized that the call, follow me, meant exactly that, because I was being taken somewhere, to a place that was unfamiliar and edgy, a place that at once invited God talk, because God talk is what we invoke when we're at the edge of our explanatory and existential capacities, but a place that at the same time challenged conventional definitions of God, turning many of them completely on their head, a place where nothing was as I had thought. The tension between this place and the place where we do our empirical science and rational philosophy is, I think, well captured by a story told by John near the end of his Gospel. It's the very famous account of doubting Thomas. Thomas is a model of the rational skeptic who demands empirical evidence as the basis for his convictions. An altogether good chap. Thomas is looking for data that will support the ludicrous notion that Jesus has risen from the dead. And the data points he seeks are interesting. They are holes made by nails and a wound made by a spear, marks of torture and murder. But when he is finally presented with the battered but living human body that forms his data set, Thomas doesn't say, now I can reject the null hypothesis with an acceptable degree of certainty. You will recall that he says simply, my Lord and my God. Here at the edge of efficacy, Thomas has been catapulted into another place, a place where he instinctively invokes God language, for he has encountered one who has thought it worth taking the trouble to meet him where he is in his skepticism, one who believes in him. And Thomas finds himself, in his turn, worshipping this one as God, a God who is not at all as he had thought. Thank you.
Wonderful.